The global lockdowns had left their mark, not just on the streets, but in people's souls. Everyone seemed to be living under an invisible weight, some indescribable anxiety that hung over daily life like a storm cloud. I wasn't immune to it either. The streets, once filled with the sounds of laughter and life, were now eerie and subdued, and people moved through them like ghosts. Those who once walked with heads held high now seemed to retreat into themselves, eyes downcast and shoulders hunched, as if scared to be noticed. The rare few who did make eye contact carried a wariness, as if any stranger could be a threat. For someone like me, a little more on the introverted side, this sense of isolation wasn't entirely new. I'd always found a strange solace in solitude, preferring the comfort of my apartment to crowded spaces. But now, even for me, it felt different. There was a certain hollowness, a sort of loneliness that was hard to shake off. In the evenings, I'd sit by the window, watching the empty street below, wondering if things would ever truly feel normal again. As the months dragged on, I found myself reaching out, craving some kind of connection. My phone became my lifeline, the screen a window to a world I couldn't physically access. Friends and family, once just a few miles away, felt like they were on another planet. Virtual happy hours and endless scrolling on social media became my daily routine. Each swipe on the screen a little reminder of what was missing from life. And soon, after exhausting every app and game on my phone, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I opened Tinder. To me, Tinder had always been more of a joke than anything else, a temporary escape filled with odd bios, awkward messages, and fleeting interests. But that night, scrolling through profile after profile, it didn't feel like a joke. There was a heaviness, a strange sense of urgency. I wasn't just swiping for fun, I was searching for something, or maybe someone, to pull me out of this endless rut. And that's when I found Haley. Her profile photo struck me first. It was a simple picture, nothing overly posed or filtered. She was sitting by a window, the sunlight catching her in a way that seemed unplanned but perfect. Her smile was soft, almost shy, and her eyes had this glint, this unexplainable spark that made me linger. She didn't look like someone trying to present a false image of herself. She looked real. Her bio was brief but intriguing. A love for indie films, a fascination with quiet spaces, and an almost poetic mention of feeling out of place in a world of noise. When I swiped right and saw the match, a small thrill ran through me. And when her message popped up a few minutes later, that thrill turned into something more, a kind of hope, maybe? A chance at connection. Our conversation flowed effortlessly, the usual small talk and awkward pauses replaced by a surprisingly genuine connection. It was as if we'd known each other for years, and as the hours ticked by, I found myself laughing, sharing parts of myself I hadn't talked about in months. There was something different about her. She didn't press or pry, and yet I felt compelled to open up. We talked about movies, about the strange quiet that had settled over the city, and the loneliness we were both feeling. She didn't just understand me, she mirrored my thoughts, as if she had been living my exact experience. That night, for the first time since the pandemic began, I felt like I wasn't alone. Finally, as the night stretched into early morning, she suggested meeting up. The suggestion was casual, almost too casual for the depth of our connection. Yet, in my eagerness to break free from the monotony of isolation, I agreed without a second thought. The usual precautions, the usual sense of wariness, it all fell away. All that mattered was the idea of seeing her, of finally putting a face to the words that had come to mean so much. I suggested my place, thinking it would feel more comfortable than some awkward, half-empty cafe. She agreed without hesitation. and we set a date. As I closed the app, a wave of excitement and nervousness washed over me, a strange mix of anticipation and doubt. But I ignored the doubt. I'd finally found a connection, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. What I didn't realize was that I wasn't inviting just anyone into my home. I was opening the door to something dark, something I would never be able to escape from. The night of our meeting finally arrived, but an uneasy feeling lingered in the air. The hours leading up to Haley's arrival felt strangely surreal. I'd spent the entire day alternating between nervous energy and quiet excitement. But now, as the evening wore on, a faint anxiety began to creep in. My apartment, usually my safe haven, felt oddly unfamiliar. Shadows seemed darker, corners more obscured. The silence, usually comforting, now had an edge to it, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I busied myself with preparations, straightening up the place and putting on some soft music to ease the tension. I glanced at the clock, 7:45 p.m. She'd be here in 15 minutes. I'd planned out everything, from the playlist to the snacks, even lighting a few candles to give the room a cozy feel. But with each passing minute, that creeping sense of unease seemed to grow stronger. Was it just nerves? Or was something more sinister at play? Then my phone buzzed a message from Haley. "On my way," she'd typed with a smiley face. That simple message should have calmed me, reassured me, but it didn't. If anything, it only heightened my anxiety. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling. I reminded myself that this was exactly what I wanted. I had been alone for far too long, and tonight, I was finally letting someone in. Still, a tiny, stubborn part of my mind whispered that something didn't feel right. Minutes ticked by slowly, and 8 o'clock came and went. She was late. I checked my phone, refreshing the app to see if she'd sent any updates, but there was nothing. Just that last, oddly cheerful message. "On my way." I reassured myself that it was probably traffic, but as 8:15 turned into 8:30, worry began to gnaw at me. I glanced around my apartment, feeling oddly exposed, as if Haley's presence was already here, even though she hadn't arrived. My eyes drifted to the front door, imagining her standing on the other side, her face partially obscured by the dim hallway light. I shook the thought away, but the image lingered, unsettlingly vivid. Finally, at 8:45, a soft knock echoed through the apartment. I practically jumped out of my skin, heart pounding. Taking a steadying breath, I opened the door, bracing myself to finally see her in person. There she was, standing in the hallway, looking almost exactly as she had in her photo. Haley's figure was slightly hunched, as if shielding herself from some invisible cold. She wore a dark coat that swallowed her frame, her hands stuffed in the pockets. Her hair, slightly tousled, framed her face in soft waves, and her eyes were exactly as I remembered, warm, but with that hint of sadness that had first drawn me in. Yet something felt off. She didn't smile, not immediately. Instead, she regarded me with an intense, almost searching gaze. I greeted her with an awkward laugh, trying to break the tension. "Sorry if I kept you waiting. Traffic was terrible," she said, her voice soft but carrying a peculiar edge. I waved it off, inviting her inside. As she stepped into the apartment, the air seemed to grow heavier. She looked around, her eyes lingering on each detail with a strange intensity, as if she were memorizing the space. I asked if she wanted something to drink, and she nodded, her movements slow, almost mechanical. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I handed her a glass of water, and she took it without a word. her gaze never quite meeting mine. The Haley I'd spoken with so openly, who had been so easy to talk to over text, seemed different now. She was distant, reserved. Watching her sip the water in silence, I felt the first real pang of fear. It was irrational, I told myself, but I couldn't deny it. Something wasn't adding up. Trying to dispel the tension, I asked her about her day, attempting to revive the spark that had drawn me to her in the first place. She answered in clipped sentences, each one more cryptic than the last. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, and her responses felt hollow, like she was simply going through the motions. She mentioned vague details about her job, her apartment, but the words didn't seem to match the person I thought I'd gotten to know. And then, out of nowhere, she asked, "Have you ever felt like you were being watched?" The question caught me off guard, chilling me to the bone. Her gaze was fixed on me now, her eyes unblinking, as if she were studying my reaction. I laughed nervously, brushing it off as a strange coincidence. But inside, my mind was racing. Why would she ask that? And why did it feel like she already knew the answer? The room felt colder, the shadows seeming to lengthen, creeping along the walls. Haley's expression remained unreadable, her eyes dark and distant. And as we sat there in silence, I realized that I was no longer sure who or what I had invited into my home. The unsettling atmosphere between us continued to thicken, turning what should have been a cozy evening into something far darker. Haley's question lingered in the air like a chill, settling over the room. "Have you ever felt like you were being watched?" she had asked, her eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to shake it off, tried to laugh, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. Sometimes," I managed, hoping my answer would lighten the mood. But Haley's expression remained unchanged, her eyes unblinking, as though she were trying to peer straight into my soul. An awkward silence settled over us, each second stretching uncomfortably. Haley was still staring, her gaze so unrelenting that I felt the urge to look away. But I didn't. Something in me, curiosity, fear, or some strange combination, held me captive. My mind raced, searching for explanations. But nothing about her behavior made sense. The warm, funny, charming person I'd met online seemed absent, replaced by this silent, watchful presence. Finally, Haley broke the silence. "Did you lock the door behind me?" she asked, her tone eerily calm. The question startled me. Yeah, I think so," I replied, trying to sound certain. But the truth was, I wasn't sure. My mind was so consumed with everything else that I couldn't remember if I'd turned the lock. Why did it matter anyway? Haley's gaze didn't falter, her eyes scanning the room again, as though she expected something or someone to emerge from the shadows. "You should always lock your door," she murmured, more to herself than to me. Her voice had taken on a strange, detached quality, almost as if she were slipping into a different reality. I forced a laugh, attempting to steer the conversation back to something normal, but she interrupted, her voice sharp and cold. "Do you know why I'm here?" Her words sent an icy shock through me. My pulse quickened, and I managed a strained, I thought. I mean, we planned to hang out, but even as I said it, I could feel that the answer wasn't enough. Haley didn't respond, just continued to look at me with that hollow, empty stare. And then she smiled, a cold, unnatural smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You invited me," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You were the one who wanted this." Her tone had changed entirely, from warm and friendly to something almost accusatory. It felt as though she were blaming me for something, though I had no idea what. My skin prickled, and I took a step back, suddenly aware of how close we were standing. I felt trapped, unable to move, my mind racing with questions that I couldn't voice. What was happening? Why was she acting like this? But then, as if she'd read my thoughts, Haley spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to show you something," she said, her tone commanding yet distant. Before I could react, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn envelope. Her hands were shaking slightly as she handed it to me, her eyes never leaving my face. I took it reluctantly, my fingers brushing against the paper, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. The envelope was old, its edges yellowed and brittle, as though it had been carried around for a long time. And on the front, in faint, smudged handwriting, was my name. My heart began to pound as I looked at the envelope. How? How do you have this?" I stammered, my mind reeling. I'd never seen this envelope before, but there it was, my name, written in a familiar script. The handwriting looked eerily like my mother's, but that was impossible. She'd passed away years ago. I looked up at Haley, my hands trembling. She simply nodded, as if encouraging me to open it. With a deep breath, I tore open the envelope, pulling out a faded photograph. My stomach dropped as I looked at the image. It was me as a child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, standing in the backyard of my childhood home. Next to me was a woman I didn't recognize, her face blurred and indistinct. But something about her posture, her stance, sent a chill down my spine. She was leaning toward me, almost protectively, her hand resting on my shoulder. And her face was twisted into an expression of pure anguish. Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Haley didn't answer. Instead, she continued to watch me with that same cold, impassive gaze. I looked back at the photo, a feeling of dread curling in my stomach. The woman's eyes seemed to bore into me, filled with an emotion I couldn't understand. Anger? Fear? Sorrow? It was impossible to tell. And then, almost imperceptibly, the edges of the photo began to darken, as if it were burning from the inside out. I gasped, dropping the photo in shock. It fluttered to the floor, the woman's blurred face now entirely blackened. But as the photo landed, something even more horrifying happened. A faint whisper filled the room, a soft, mournful voice that seemed to echo from every corner. "Why did you forget me?" it asked, the words lingering in the air like a chilling fog. I looked up at Haley, my heart pounding wildly. Her expression had changed, her face now twisted into that same look of sorrow and anger that the woman in the photograph had worn. And then, she leaned in close, her cold breath tickling my ear as she whispered, "I told you, you were the one who invited me." In that moment, I realized the horrifying truth. Haley wasn't just some random stranger. She was here because I had unknowingly called her back into my life, this lost, sorrowful presence that I had somehow left behind. The room felt darker, colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around us as Haley's mournful gaze bored into me, leaving me trapped in the grip of a terror I had unwittingly invited into my own home. I woke up in my apartment, but everything was wrong. The place looked like it had been ransacked. Couch cushions were torn open, shelves ripped from walls, and scattered belongings covered the floor. My head throbbed as I staggered up, my body heavy with aches and bruises. The sight of a large, blood-red pentagram scrawled on my wall made my blood run cold. Memories of the night before flooded back, but I couldn't piece them together. Haley. She had drugged me, but for what purpose? My mind raced as I tried to comprehend the horror around me. My hands were scratched, covered in dried blood, someone else's blood. Desperation took over as I stumbled around, searching for my phone, my keys, anything familiar. They were gone. My apartment, once my sanctuary, felt alien, hostile, as if some dark force had claimed it. And then, I felt a presence. It was faint but unmistakable, like eyes watching from the shadows. I turned towards the hallway and saw a figure, a shadow just beyond the edge of my vision. My heart raced as I tried to move, to escape, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the shadow was gone. Panic surged, and I stumbled towards the door, yanking at the handle. It was locked tight. I was trapped. The air grew colder, and a faint, eerie creak echoed from the ceiling above. Something was upstairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen, fear curling around me like smoke. I knew I had to escape, but the door remained immovable. Then, from the direction of my bedroom, a dull red glow began to seep under the door. I felt my skin prickle as I forced myself forward, each step a battle against the suffocating dread in my chest. When I reached the door, the glow pulsed like a heartbeat, and I heard a low, guttural chanting that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't human. With trembling hands, I opened the door. Inside, Haley stood before a mirror, her back to me, whispering in a voice I didn't recognize. Her reflection, however, was not her own. Beside her was a figure, a towering, gaunt shadow with hollow eyes, staring directly at me through the mirror. As if sensing my presence, Haley's reflection twisted into a grotesque grin, her eyes dark and hollow, filled with something ancient and malevolent. "This wasn't just a date," she hissed. "It was a summons." She turned slowly to face me, her features distorted, monstrous. Behind her, the figure from the mirror loomed closer, its dark eyes swallowing the light. In the mirror, I saw myself twisted, blood-stained, an image of myself corrupted beyond recognition. A scream clawed at my throat, but no sound escaped. The room spun, and once again, everything went black. I woke up alone, lying in the middle of an empty street as dawn broke over the city. My clothes were torn, my skin bruised and bloodied. The nightmare felt vivid, etched into my memory, but my surroundings were silent, indifferent. There was no trace of Haley or of the horrors I'd witnessed. As I rose to my feet, trembling and broken, I felt a chill on my skin. Whatever entity had taken her place, whatever darkness I'd invited into my life, was still out there. And I knew, with a haunting certainty, that it wasn't finished with me yet. And if you want to hear more terrifying tales, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. You never know when the next story will be about you. Stay safe out there, and remember, not everything you see is what it seems.